"I'm pregnant with your husband's child," my daughter-in-law whispered, her voice so soft no one else at the table could hear it, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the middle of what was supposed to be a simple Sunday family dinner. But when I turned to look at Vanessa, she was already watching me, her lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that didn't belong in a room filled with warm lighting, polished silverware, and a roast I had spent 3 hours preparing, and I realized then that she meant every word, that she had chosen this moment carefully, surrounded by my son, by my husband, by the life I had built over 40 years, to place that sentence directly into my hands and wait to see what I would do with it, and I did nothing, at least not in the way she expected, because I simply smiled back at her, slow and measured, then reached for my glass of water as if she had just commented on the weather, as if nothing in my world had just shifted out of place, and across the table, Daniel was talking about something work-related, his voice steady, oblivious, or pretending to be, I couldn't tell which, while Richard sat beside me, cutting his meat into careful pieces, not once looking in my direction, not once asking why the air between his wife and his mother had suddenly grown so still, and it was in that quiet, in that ordinary clinking of forks and low conversation, that something inside me settled into a clarity I hadn't felt in years, because the truth was, this didn't begin tonight, not really, it had been unfolding in small, almost invisible ways for weeks, maybe longer, in the way Richard had started leaving the house earlier than usual, saying he had errands that never seemed to end, in the way Vanessa had grown more comfortable moving through my kitchen as if it were already hers, opening cabinets without asking, rearranging things I had kept the same for decades, in the way Daniel had stopped meeting my eyes during conversations, offering quick answers, distracted smiles, always somewhere else even when he was sitting right in front of me, and I had noticed all of it, every small shift, every silence that lingered a second too long, every glance that ended too quickly, but I had told myself it was nothing, that families change, that people grow distant sometimes, that I was imagining patterns where there were none, and now here she was, leaning into my space, placing a sentence so deliberate, so final, that it erased every excuse I had made for them, and still, I did not react, not because I didn't feel it, but because I understood something she clearly did not, that power does not belong to the person who speaks first, but to the one who decides when the truth is revealed, and as I sat there, listening to the low hum of conversation, the faint clatter of dishes, the sound of my family continuing as if nothing had happened, I realized that this moment was not the beginning of my humiliation, it was the confirmation of something I had already begun to see, already begun to understand, and more importantly, already begun to prepare for. Because by the time Vanessa leaned in and whispered those words into my ear, she thought she was taking something from me, but what she had really done was show me exactly where to look, and exactly where to stand, when it was finally time for me to respond. 2 days before that dinner, the house had already begun to feel different, though nothing obvious had changed, not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but I have lived in that house for over 40 years, and when you spend that much time in one place, you learn to recognize the subtle shifts, the kind that do not announce themselves but settle quietly into the walls, into the routines, into the spaces between words, and that morning had started like any other. I woke up at 6:30. Made my coffee the same way I always did, 2 spoons of ground coffee, 1 cup of water, no sugar, and I stood by the kitchen window watching the light come in over the backyard, but even then, something felt off, not wrong exactly, just slightly out of rhythm, like a song playing half a second too slow. Richard came downstairs later than usual, already dressed, already holding his phone in his hand, and when I said good morning, he answered without looking up, just a quick morning before stepping past me to grab his keys, and I remember thinking how strange it was that he did not ask about breakfast, because for years, that had been our routine, eggs on Sundays, toast on weekdays, something simple but shared, and yet that morning, he said he had to leave early, that he had things to take care of, and I nodded, because that is what you do when you have been married for decades, you do not question every change, you give space, you trust, but the silence he left behind lingered longer than it should have. And later that afternoon, Vanessa stopped by without calling ahead, which in itself was not unusual, but the way she moved through the house was, she did not wait for me to offer her anything. She opened the refrigerator, looked through the shelves, even moved a jar from one side to the other as if she was already memorizing where everything belonged, and when I asked if Daniel was coming too, she said he was busy, that he might come later, her tone casual, almost rehearsed, and I watched her. As she stood in my kitchen, wearing that soft smile she always wore, the one that seemed polite until you looked closely enough to see that it never quite reached her eyes, and there was a moment, just a brief one, where she glanced down the hallway toward the staircase. And it was such a small thing, so easy to dismiss, but something about it stayed with me, the way people look when they are checking if a door is closed, or if someone is listening, and that night, when Richard came home, he went straight upstairs without his usual pause in the living room, without asking about dinner, without sitting beside me on the couch like he had done for years, and I sat there alone, the television on but the sound low, realizing that the quiet in the house was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, layered with things unspoken, and still, I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, that people have phases, that marriages shift over time, but the truth is, deep down, I had already started to notice the pattern, the way their absences lined up, the way their conversations shortened when I entered the room, the way Daniel seemed increasingly distant without explanation, and I did not confront it. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand it first, because there is a difference between suspicion and certainty, and I have learned over the years that if you speak too soon, you give people the chance to rewrite the truth, and I was not ready to let that happen, not yet, not when I could feel, with a quiet certainty I could not explain, that something far more deliberate was unfolding right inside the walls of my own home. The next morning, just after 8, there was a knock at my front door, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, the kind of knock that waits for you to answer because it already knows you are home, and when I opened it, I found Claire Bennett standing on my porch, her coat buttoned even though the air was already warming with the early sun, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if she had been rehearsing what to say and was afraid the words might fall apart if she moved too much, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Because Claire had always been the kind of woman who filled silence easily, who commented on the weather, the neighborhood, the smallest details of life, but that morning, she simply looked at me, her eyes searching mine in a way that made my chest tighten before she even opened her mouth, and I stepped aside to let her in without asking why she had come, because something in her expression told me this was not a casual visit, and we moved into the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had stood the day before watching Vanessa move through my space like she belonged there, and Claire sat down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a placemat as if she needed something steady beneath them, and when she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, almost careful, like she was trying not to disturb something fragile. She said that she had been debating whether to come, that she had gone back and forth all night, and I listened without interrupting. Because I could already feel the direction this was heading, not the details, not yet, but the weight of it, the kind of truth that does not arrive gently, and then she told me that 2 days earlier, she had stopped by a small cafe downtown, the one on Maple Street where people go when they want a quiet corner and a good cup of coffee, and she had seen Richard there, sitting across from Vanessa, and at first, she thought nothing of it, because families meet, they talk, they share time. But then she noticed the way they were leaning toward each other, the way their conversation did not carry the casual distance of in-laws, the way Vanessa reached across the table, not briefly, not accidentally, but with intention, resting her hand over his for a moment longer than necessary, and Claire paused when she said that, watching my face carefully, as if expecting me to react, but I did not give her anything, not because I did not feel it, but because I needed her to continue, and she did. She told me that she had not approached them, that she had sat there quietly, trying to convince herself she was misunderstanding what she saw, that there had to be another explanation, but the longer she watched, the harder that became, and when they stood to leave, Richard placed his hand at the small of Vanessa's back in a way that was too familiar, too practiced, something that does not happen by accident, and Claire said she had left immediately after, that she had felt like she was witnessing something she was not meant to see, something that would change everything if it were spoken aloud, and when she finished, the kitchen felt smaller somehow, the air heavier, as if her words had settled into every corner of the room, and still, I did not react the way she expected. I did not question her, did not ask for more details, did not try to deny it, because as she spoke, I realized that what she was giving me was not a shock. It was confirmation, a piece of a pattern I had already begun to trace, and I simply nodded, slowly, letting the silence return between us, because in that moment, I understood that the truth had already entered my house long before Claire ever knocked on my door. She had only given it a voice. After Claire left, I did not move right away. I stayed at the kitchen table with my hands resting flat against the surface, feeling the faint texture of the wood beneath my palms. As if I needed something solid to remind me that I was still standing in the same house, the same life, even though something inside it had shifted permanently, and for a long time, I simply sat there, letting the silence stretch out around me. Because once a truth settles in, it does not rush, it does not shout, it begins to rearrange everything quietly, piece by piece, until what once felt familiar starts to look different under its weight, and that is when the memories began to return, not all at once, but slowly, like small fragments rising to the surface, moments I had dismissed, things I had chosen not to question, each one now fitting into place with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. I remembered the evening Richard said he had a late meeting and came home nearly 3 hours past the time he had mentioned, his explanation simple, almost careless, as if he expected me not to look too closely, and I had not then. I remembered the way Vanessa had started texting more frequently, her phone lighting up on the counter when she visited, her expression tightening for just a second before she turned the screen away, saying it was nothing important. And I had accepted that answer because it was easier than asking why it felt wrong. I remembered the Sunday Daniel canceled dinner at the last minute, his voice distracted, saying they had other plans, while later that same evening, I noticed 2 wine glasses left in the sink that I had not used, placed there as if someone had tried to make them blend in with the rest of the dishes, and at the time, I told myself it must have been from the night before, that I was forgetting things, that age was playing tricks on me. But now, standing there with all those moments lined up one after another, I could see how carefully I had been guided away from the truth, how each small detail had been softened, explained, or ignored until it became easier to believe in coincidence than intention. And perhaps the hardest part was not what they had done, but how naturally they had done it, how easily they had continued sitting at my table, eating the meals I prepared, speaking to me with the same polite tones, as if nothing beneath the surface had changed, and I realized then that this was not something that had happened suddenly. It had been building quietly, layered beneath ordinary days and routine conversations, hidden in plain sight because I had trusted the people closest to me not to give me a reason to look closer, and yet, now that I had seen it, truly seen it, I could not unsee it, every glance, every silence, every small inconsistency forming a pattern so clear it almost felt deliberate, as if they had believed I would never put the pieces together, as if they had counted on me choosing comfort over truth, and for a moment, I wondered how long it had been this way, how many dinners had been shared under the same roof while something else moved just out of sight. But that question no longer mattered as much as it once might have, because the past, no matter how carefully examined, does not change what stands in front of you, and what stood in front of me now was not confusion, not doubt, but certainty. And with that certainty came something else, something quieter but far more powerful, the understanding that I no longer needed to guess, no longer needed to question whether I was imagining things, because the truth had already revealed itself, not in one moment, but in many, and now, for the first time, I was ready to stop looking away from it. That afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom longer than usual, not because I was looking for answers there, but because I wanted to see if I could still recognize the woman staring back at me, and what I saw was not someone broken, not someone defeated, but someone who had finally stopped pretending not to notice what had been placed right in front of her, and that realization settled into me with a kind of calm I had not expected, because pain, when it is sharp and sudden, can make you react, can push you into saying things you cannot take back, but this was different. This was something that had unfolded slowly, carefully, and now that I understood it, I realized that reacting too quickly would only serve the people who had created it, so I made a decision right there, standing in that quiet room, that I would not confront Richard. Not yet, that I would not question Vanessa, not yet, and I would not go to Daniel searching for explanations he might not be ready to give. Instead, I would watch, I would listen, and most importantly, I would let them believe that nothing had changed. Because there is a certain kind of freedom in being underestimated, in allowing others to think you are unaware, unobservant, or simply too trusting to see what is happening around you. And that evening, when Richard came home, I greeted him the same way I always did, asked about his day, listened as he spoke in general terms, avoiding specifics the way he had learned to do so effortlessly, and I nodded at the right moments, offered the same small responses, all while noticing how easily he relaxed into the familiar rhythm, how quickly he accepted that I had not noticed anything different. And later, when Vanessa called to say she and Daniel would not be coming by that weekend, her voice light, almost cheerful, I responded with the same warmth I had always given her, telling her that was perfectly fine, that they should enjoy their time. And when I hung up the phone, I did not feel anger the way I might have expected. I felt clarity, because their behavior was no longer confusing. It was consistent, predictable, and that meant it could be understood. And once something can be understood, it can also be anticipated. And as the hours passed, I began to think not about what they had done, but about what they might do next. About what they believed they were building, about how far they thought they could go without being questioned. And that is when I realized something else, something that had been quietly forming beneath everything else, that whatever this was, it was not just about hidden conversations or moments that crossed boundaries. There was intention behind it, planning, a direction that extended beyond secrecy into something more structured, something that involved time, access, and trust. And if that was true, then I could not afford to respond emotionally, not yet, because emotion clouds judgment, and what I needed now was precision, patience, and the willingness to let things unfold just a little longer, because the truth, when it is given time, has a way of revealing not just what happened, but why, and I intended to understand both before I made a single move. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already begun organizing itself around what I needed to understand, and instead of moving through my routine automatically, I paid attention to everything, to the way the house sounded when it was empty, to the way the light moved across the kitchen floor, to the details I had once overlooked because I had never needed to question them before. And after breakfast, I walked into Richard's study, something I rarely did without a reason, but that day, I allowed myself to create one. I told myself I was looking for an old insurance document, something harmless, something that would not raise suspicion if he happened to ask. And as I stood there, surrounded by shelves I had dusted for years without ever examining too closely, I began to notice small things that had changed, folders that had been moved, papers stacked in a way that did not match his usual order, a drawer that did not close as smoothly as it once had, and when I opened it, carefully, slowly, I found documents I had never seen before, statements, copies, records that suggested more than just routine finances, and I did not rush, I did not take anything out of place. I simply read, absorbing what I could without disturbing the structure, because I understood that once something is noticed, it must also remain unnoticed to those who are trying to keep it hidden, and what I saw was enough to confirm what had been forming in my mind, that this situation was not limited to quiet meetings or inappropriate closeness. There were financial movements, subtle but consistent, transfers that had been made in small increments, changes in account access, names appearing where they had not been before, and while none of it alone would have seemed alarming, together, they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. And as I closed the drawer and stepped back into the hallway, I felt something shift inside me again, not shock, not even anger, but a deeper understanding of the scope of what I was facing, because betrayal of the heart is one thing, painful, yes, but often chaotic, unpredictable, driven by impulse, but this was measured, organized, intentional, something that required time, agreement, and a shared goal, and that meant I was no longer dealing with a mistake or a moment of weakness. I was dealing with a plan, and plans can be studied, plans can be anticipated, and most importantly, plans can be interrupted. And later that afternoon, when I sat down at the dining table with a notepad in front of me, I did not write down accusations or questions. I wrote down observations, dates, small details that might have seemed insignificant on their own, but together created a timeline. And as I looked at what I had gathered, I realized that I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was beginning to see where it was going. And once you can see the direction of something, you are no longer at its mercy, because you can choose where to stand when it arrives. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like someone waiting for the truth to unfold. I felt like someone preparing for the moment when it finally would. Over the next few days, I stopped trying to fill the silence between us, and instead, I let it exist exactly as it was, because silence, when you listen carefully, has a way of revealing more than conversation ever could, and it was in that quiet that I began to notice Daniel more clearly than I had in years, not as my son, not as the boy who once needed me for everything, but as a man standing in the middle of something he was either too weak to confront or too willing to ignore, and the first time it truly stood out to me was during a short visit he made late on a Wednesday afternoon. He arrived alone, without Vanessa, which was unusual, and for a moment, I wondered if this was the beginning of something shifting, if perhaps he had come to speak, to explain, to acknowledge what had been happening around him, but instead, he stayed near the doorway, his posture hesitant, his eyes moving around the room as if he was searching for something he could not quite name, and when I asked if he wanted coffee, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice before saying yes, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had sat with Claire, where I had begun to understand everything that was unfolding, and I watched him carefully as he spoke about ordinary things, work, traffic, small frustrations that did not require honesty, and every time the conversation moved even slightly towards something real, something personal, he shifted it back, redirecting it with a practiced ease that told me this was not new behavior, this was something he had been doing for some time, and at one point, I asked him a simple question, whether everything was all right at home, and he smiled, a quick, controlled smile, and said everything was fine, that they had just been busy, that there was nothing to worry about, and I nodded as if I believed him, because I understood now that what he was offering me was not the truth, it was protection, not for me, but for himself, because acknowledging what was happening would require him to take a position, to choose, and instead, he had chosen the safer path, the quieter one, the one that allowed things to continue without disruption, and as I sat across from him, I realized that his silence was not neutral, it was a decision, a quiet agreement to let things remain exactly as they were, and that realization settled into me with a weight that felt heavier than anything else I had uncovered so far. Because betrayal from a husband can be explained, even anticipated, but the absence of courage from a son, the unwillingness to see, to ask, to stand for something, that was a different kind of loss, one that does not arrive suddenly, but reveals itself slowly, in the spaces where something should exist and does not, and when he left that afternoon, thanking me for the coffee, promising to visit again soon, I stood at the door and watched him walk to his car, noticing how quickly he got inside, how little he looked back, and I understood then that whatever role he was playing in this situation, whether active or passive, it would not be one that would protect me, and that meant, more than ever, that I would have to rely on myself, not just to understand what was happening, but to decide how it would end. By the end of that week, I had already decided how I wanted the next step to unfold, not in anger, not in confrontation, but with a kind of quiet precision that only comes when you stop reacting and start choosing, and so I did something I had not done in a long time. I planned a dinner, not out of habit, not out of obligation, but with intention. I called Daniel first, my voice steady, warm, exactly as it had always been, and I told him I wanted the family together on Sunday, that it had been too long, that I missed having everyone at the table, and he agreed without hesitation, perhaps relieved that I was not asking questions, perhaps believing that everything could continue as it had, and then I called Vanessa, and she answered on the second ring, her tone bright, almost eager, and I extended the same invitation, careful, measured, leaving no space for suspicion, and she accepted as well, her voice carrying that same soft confidence I had come to recognize, and when I hung up, I stood in the center of my kitchen and looked around slowly, taking in every detail, the cabinets I had chosen years ago, the table that had seen birthdays, holidays, ordinary evenings that once felt secure, and I realized that this space, which had always been a place of comfort, was about to become something else entirely, not a place of conflict, but a place where truth would no longer be avoided, and over the next 2 days, I prepared everything myself, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted control over every element. I went to the grocery store early in the morning when it was still quiet, selecting ingredients with the same care I always had, fresh vegetables, a cut of meat I knew Daniel preferred, a dessert Vanessa had once complimented, and there was something almost ironic in that, in preparing their favorite dishes while knowing what I knew, but I did it anyway, because this was not about them. It was about me deciding how this moment would look, how it would feel, how it would unfold, and the night before the dinner, I set the table, placing each plate, each glass, each piece of silverware exactly where it belonged, making sure everything appeared unchanged, because the more ordinary it seemed, the less they would question it, and as I stood back and looked at the finished table, I felt a calm settle over me. Not the kind that comes from ignorance, but the kind that comes from understanding exactly where you are and what you are about to do. And on Sunday afternoon, as the house filled with the familiar sounds of footsteps, voices, the door opening and closing, I greeted each of them the same way I always had, with a smile, with warmth, with no indication that anything beneath the surface had shifted, and they responded in kind, stepping into the roles they had grown comfortable playing, unaware that this time, I was not simply part of the scene, I had arranged it, and as we all took our seats around the table, as the conversation began to flow in its usual patterns, I looked at each of them, one by one, and realized that for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer waiting for something to happen, I was ready for it. For a while, everything continued exactly as expected, the soft clinking of silverware, the polite exchanges, the careful balance of voices that had always defined our dinners, and I let it go on just long enough for them to settle into it, for them to believe that this evening was no different from any other, that whatever had been said, whatever had been done, had not changed the rhythm of this house. And then, at a moment so ordinary it almost felt invisible, I set my fork down and folded my hands in my lap, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention immediately, but with enough intention that it shifted something in the air, and one by one, their voices softened, their movements slowed, until the conversation paused without anyone quite understanding why, and I looked first at Daniel, because it felt right to begin with him, and I asked him a simple question, whether he had been reviewing the financial documents his father had been working on recently, and he blinked, clearly caught off guard, his eyes moving briefly toward Richard before returning to me, and he said no, that he had not been involved in any of that, and I nodded as if that answer confirmed something I already knew, because it did. And then I turned to Richard, meeting his gaze fully for the first time in days, and I asked him if he would mind explaining the recent changes to our accounts, the transfers, the updated access permissions, the documents that now included names that had not been there before, and for a moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, I saw something I had not seen before, not confidence, not control, but calculation, the quick movement of someone trying to decide which version of the truth would serve him best. And before he could speak, I reached beside me and placed a folder on the table, not forcefully, just enough to make its presence known, and I opened it slowly, turning it so that all of them could see, and inside were copies, records, dates, details that spoke clearly without needing explanation, and I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse. I simply let the evidence exist between us, undeniable, complete, and I could feel the shift in the room. The way Vanessa's posture changed slightly, the way her expression, so carefully composed, tightened just enough to reveal that she understood exactly what she was looking at, and Daniel's confusion deepened, his eyes moving from one page to another, from his father to his wife, as if trying to piece together something he had never been allowed to see clearly, and then I spoke again, calmly, evenly, explaining that over the past several weeks, I had taken the time to review everything, not out of suspicion at first, but out of necessity, and what I found was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, but a series of deliberate choices, decisions that affected not only finances, but ownership, access, and ultimately, my place within the life I had built, and I paused there, not to give them space to respond, but to let the weight of what I had said settle fully, because this was not a conversation I intended to rush, and then, with the same steady tone, I told them that I had already spoken with an attorney, that I had taken steps to secure what was mine, to ensure that no further changes could be made without my knowledge, and that any decisions moving forward would no longer be made in quiet conversations or behind closed doors, and I looked at Vanessa then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that did not need to be explained, and in that moment, I understood something very simple, that power does not come from raising your voice or demanding control. It comes from knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to move from it, and as I stood up from the table, leaving the folder where it was, I did not wait for their reactions, did not ask for explanations, because I had already heard everything I needed to hear, not in their words, but in their silence, and as I walked away, I could feel the space behind me shift, not because I had broken it, but because for the first time, I had stopped holding it together for them.